My fated mate promised me a crown, then traded my soul for a border deal. I was one step away from exile, a death sentence in the snow, when the man they call the silent executioner did the impossible. He didn't just block the gates. He bared his fangs at his own king and broke a 10-year silence to claim me as his queen. But don't be fooled. He didn't save me because he's a hero. He's a monster who knows my darkest secret, that my touch can hush the madness of a wolf or shatter a soul into dust. And as my father steps out of the shadows with a crown made of my mother's blood, the king is about to realize he didn't just reject a worthless omega, he rejected the only thing standing between him and the end of the world. Now the straw. The scent of my fated mate didn't smell like home. It smelled like a freshly dug grave. Elara stood in the centre of the kitchen, and the heat from the hearth licked at her skin like a hungry animal. The great den was always loud, filled with the clatter of iron and the shouting of men, but today the noise felt like a physical weight on her chest. She scrubbed a heavy iron pot until her fingers bled, because an invisible omega had to be perfect to survive in a pack that valued only strength. The grease was thick and black, coating her arms, yet she didn't stop because moving was the only thing keeping the panic at bay. After that, she looked across the room and saw Joran. He was a young guard with a kind face, but today his eyes were turning a sickly, glowing yellow that made her blood run cold. He began to shake. The sound of his bones popping and snapping filled the room like dry wood breaking in a fire. It was a feral snap, the moment a wolf loses its mind and tears everything apart. Next, the other workers screamed and ran for the stone exits, tripping over stools and spilling buckets of water. They knew the king's iron claws would kill Joran the moment he shifted into a mad beast to protect the rest of the pack. From there, Elara felt the power waking up behind her ribs, a cold and heavy sensation that felt like liquid moonlight. She didn't want to use it because showing her gift was a death sentence in a world that feared what it couldn't control. If the Alpha King knew she could reach into a warrior's mind, he would lock her in a stone cage and never let her see the sun again. Soon after, she watched Joran lunge at a defenseless kitchen girl who was huddled in the corner. Elara stopped thinking about the danger to herself. She didn't move her body, but she threw her mind forward like a silk net made of stars. She wrapped her soul around Joran's frantic heart and whispered to his blood in a language that only the moon understood. Be still, be quiet, be cold. What followed was a silence so thick and heavy it felt like snow falling in the middle of a roaring fire. Joran's bones stopped snapping. His eyes turned back to a soft human brown, and the growl in his throat died away. He slumped to the grease-slicked floor and he was safe, even if he didn't know why. Still, Elara's head spun from the effort and a sharp pain stabbed behind her eyes. She leaned against the heavy prep table and her breath came in ragged gasps that hurt her throat. Have you ever had a secret so big it felt like it was eating you from the inside out? That was Elara's life, a constant game of hide-and-seek with her own soul. She remembered her mother's last words before the king's men took her away to the silent towers. Hide your light, Elara, because the dark things in this world will want to use it to see. Yet, Elara couldn't help but feel a tiny sliver of pride in her chest. She had saved a life today without spilling a single drop of blood. She had fixed what the Alpha King's harsh rules had broken. Even so, she felt a sudden chill on the back of her neck that made every tiny hair on her arms stand up. Despite that cold feeling, she forced herself to look up into the high, soot-stained stone rafters where the shadows lived. A man sat there perched like a hunting hawk on a branch. It was Fenris, the war hound. He was the king's shadow and the man responsible for every execution in the den. He didn't have a normal wolf scent of pine and musk. He smelled like old blood, cold iron, and the deepest part of winter. On the other hand, his eyes were as bright and sharp as gold coins in the dark. He was staring right at her with an intensity that made her hush recoil in fear. He had seen the way Joran calmed down. He had seen the way Elara's eyes turned a brilliant silver for just a second. He knew she wasn't just a weak throwaway Omega meant to scrub pots. More importantly, he didn't move or call for the guards to arrest her. He just watched her with a hungry, heavy stare that made her feel like he was reading the very secrets of her heart. In fact, the space between them seemed to vibrate with a strange, electrical energy. Elara felt her skin prickle with a heat she couldn't explain, even as the kitchen grew cold. She wondered why the most dangerous man in the pack was keeping her secret instead of turning her in. Not only that, she wondered what a man like Fenris would want in exchange for his silence in a place where nothing was free. She went back to her work, scrubbing the same iron pot until it shone, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. What's worse, she felt an open loop in her mind, a question she couldn't answer. Who was the man in the black cloak she had seen talking to the king in the gardens last night? She knew he was looking for a female with her specific bloodline. To make things worse, the king had looked happy when they spoke, and Varick was only happy when he was about to hurt someone. Moments later, the heavy oak doors of the kitchen swung open with a bang that echoed like a drum. Two guards with thick leather armor and silver-tipped spears stepped inside, their faces grim. "Elara!" one shouted, his voice hard and cold. "The Alpha King wants you in the High Hall, now!" Her heart skipped a beat, and her stomach dropped like a stone into a well. Had Fenris told them already? By the time she reached the door, she looked back at the high rafters one last time. Fenris was gone, leaving only the smell of winter and a single black feather behind on the ledge. Elara walked toward the throne room and she felt like she was walking toward her own execution. Eventually, Elara reached the great hall where the scent of wealth and hidden blood mixed together. The air here was thick with the smell of roasted meat, pine needles, and the sharp tang of expensive wine. King Varick sat on a throne made of twisted oak, and the bleached bones of wolves who had once dared to disobey him. He was her fated mate, the man the moon had chosen for her, but he was also her greatest nightmare. That night, he looked more handsome than usual in his dark furs, but his smile was as sharp as a razor and didn't reach his cold eyes. "Come here, my love," he said, reaching out a hand that was covered in gold rings. His voice was like honey poured over a hidden knife. Come morning. She knew she would regret trusting a single word he said, but for now she had to play the part of the perfect loyal mate. But then he grabbed her arm and pulled her close to his side with a strength that bruised her skin. His touch was cold, so cold it felt like ice was spreading through her veins. "You look beautiful today, Elara," he whispered, his breath smelling of bitter ale and peppermint. Instead of feeling loved or safe, she felt like a small bird trapped in a silver cage. He leaned in to nip at her neck, a claim of ownership that made her skin crawl with disgust. Rather, she tried not to flinch or show her fear, because Varick loved to see his victims tremble. Meanwhile, the High Council was watching them from their long wooden benches. They were old men with grey fur and greedy hearts who hated her because she was an Omega. They thought she was a weak link in the pack's chain that needed to be cut away and burned. At the same time, Varick turned to the room and stood up, pulling Elara with him like a trophy. "The Northern Ravagers want a deal," he announced, his voice booming off the stone walls. The room went dead silent, and even the fire seemed to stop crackling. The Ravagers were killers who didn't follow the laws of the Moon Goddess and were known for their cruelty. Because of that, everyone in the room was holding their breath and waiting for the blow to fall. "They want land," Varick said, his voice rising with a false sense of pride. "And they want a sign of peace that will last for 100 years. As a result, Elara felt a cold pit of dread grow in her stomach. She looked at the king's face and she saw a man who was counting coins and measuring her worth in gold. So she tried to pull her arm away from his iron grip. "What kind of sign?" "Varick?" she asked, her voice small and trembling in the vast room. That's why he gripped her arm even harder until she felt her bones groan under the pressure. His claws began to dig into her skin, drawing tiny beads of red blood that stained her sleeve. Which meant he was losing his temper, and everyone knew that Varick was a monster when he felt challenged. Truth be told, Varick didn't love her at all. He only loved the power that the fated mate bond gave him over the pack. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't feel the warm glow in her chest that the old stories always talked about. Instead, it was just a hollow ache and a sense of coming doom. Maybe it was fate that brought them together, but it felt more like a prison the world had built just for her. She didn't know what scared her more, the Ravagers waiting outside the walls or the cold, dark look in Varick's eyes. Deep down, she knew the truth long before he said the words out loud. He was going to give her away to buy himself a few more years of power and peace. Before she could move, he leaned in close to her ear so only she could hear his cruel whisper. "They need an Omega to breed into their line, Elara. They want someone pure and soft, someone exactly like you." Her world tilted on its axis, and she felt like she was falling into a dark hole. He was selling his own fated mate to a pack of monsters just to save his own throne. Without warning, she felt a surge of hot anger. It wasn't the hush this time. It was a red fire in her blood that made her want to fight. In that moment, she wanted to use her power to make him scream and fall to his knees. As if pulled by a string, she felt a heavy, familiar gaze on her from the back of the massive hall. She looked past the torches and the plates of meat to find Fenris standing there. He was leaning against a dark stone pillar with his arms crossed over his chest. He looked bored to anyone else, but his eyes were like golden lasers cutting through the crowd. Her body moved on instinct as she took a small step toward the edge of the dais. Without thinking, she realized that the warhound was the only person in the entire room who wasn't smiling at the king's deal. As the silence stretched, she wondered if he was the monster the king said he was, or if he was the only man with a soul left in the den. With every heartbeat, The tension in the room grew until it felt like a string about to snap. Varick was laughing now, talking to the High Council about the silver mines they would get in exchange for her life. They were talking about her as if she were a bag of grain or a pile of winter wood. In the span of a breath, Elara realized she had to run and never look back. She had to get out of the den before the sun went down and the gates were locked for the night. But where could a lone Omega go? In a world of predators? The den was surrounded by miles of dark forest, and the king's hunters were the best in the land. The moment their eyes locked, she saw Fenris shake his head, a movement so tiny it was almost invisible. He was telling her no. He was telling her to stay right where she was. Without another word, he turned his back and walked out of the hall into the cold rain. Before either could speak, the northern messenger stepped forward from the shadows near the entrance. He was a massive man with a jagged scar that ran from his ear to his throat. He smelled like rot, wet dog, and the old death of the battlefield. As if fate demanded it, he walked straight up to the king's throne without bowing. He didn't show any respect. He just looked at Elara with hungry, dark eyes that made her feel naked. He reached out a dirty, calloused hand to touch her face, his fingers feeling like rough sandpaper. "She will do," he growled, his voice sounding like stones grinding together. Between one breath and the next, Elara's wolf stirred deep inside her for the first time. It was small and weak, but it was hers, in the echo of his voice. She felt her mother's courage flare up in her heart. She slapped his hand away with a loud crack that echoed through the hall. Before the words left her lips, the great hall went dead quiet, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. As the wind shifted outside, Varick's face turned a deep, bruised purple with pure rage. "How dare you!" he bellowed, his voice shaking the rafters. He backhanded her across the face with the full strength of an alpha. The force of the blow sent her spinning across the stone floor like a leaf in a storm. She hit the ground hard and the sharp taste of copper filled her mouth. Beneath the moonlight that filtered through the high windows, she looked like a broken doll in the dirt. Under the weight of his stare, she felt her spirit start to shatter into 1,000 tiny pieces. While the forest held its breath outside, Varick stood over her, his shadow blocking out the light of the torches. "You are nothing, Elara. You are a tool to be used. And tools do not talk back to their masters." He looked at the guards with cold, dead eyes that held no mercy. "Take her to the cells. We will give her to the Ravagers at dawn." As the truth unravelled, Elara realized she was truly alone in this cruel world. No one moved to help her, not even the workers she had known for years. Between them, something cracked in that moment. The bond. The fake forced bond she had tried so hard to believe in finally shattered like cheap glass. As her wolf stirred, she felt a different kind of power rising from the floor. It wasn't the hush that calmed people down. It was a roar of pure defiance. With a single glance at the guards, she realized they were suddenly afraid of something behind her. They weren't looking at the broken girl on the floor. They were looking at the doorway. As if summoned by her own scream of pain, a massive shadow fell over the entire room. Fenris had returned from the rain. He wasn't just standing in the back anymore. He was walking toward the king's throne with a heavy, rhythmic stride. The tension broke when Varick barked a desperate order. "Hound, do your job! Take this trash to the cells and lock her away." When her name left his lips, Fenris didn't move to grab her or pull her hair. He stepped in front of her, his massive back acting like a shield against the world. He stood directly between Elara and the king's wrath. As the sky darkened with the coming storm, a low, rumbling growl started deep in Fenris's chest. It wasn't a normal wolf's growl, it was something older and more primal. While her pulse raced, Elara watched the back of the man who was supposed to be the king's executioner. He was defying his alpha. He was blocking the gate to her prison and choosing a side. With every step he took, the king's elite guards stepped back in genuine fear. Fenris was the war hound because he was the strongest and most lethal wolf anyone had ever seen. He didn't need a golden crown to be a king, and he didn't need a pack to be a leader. As the bond pulsed, a new strange bond that felt like a heartbeat against her own, Elara felt a heat in her chest. It wasn't the cold ache she felt with Varick. It was a burning, intense fire that promised to keep her warm. She felt it, etched in fire, that Fenris wasn't protecting her because of an order from the throne. He was protecting her because he wanted her for himself. Her world tilted when Fenris finally spoke, his voice cracking the silence of the room. He hadn't said a word to anyone in 10 long, lonely years. People thought he was mute because his heart was too full of the blood he had shed. "No," he said, and the word was a jagged rock falling into a quiet pool. It was a landslide. Something inside her shifted as she heard the sound of his voice for the first time. It was deep and rough, like gravel and velvet mixed together. The king gasped in shock, and the High Council fell back over their benches in terror. "What did you say?" Varick screamed, his face twisting into a mask of hate. He shifted his hands into long black claws. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Fenris didn't even shift his form. He didn't need to. He just bared his teeth and the whole room went cold, as if the world narrowed down to just the 3 of them. Elara watched the standoff. "She stays," Fenris growled, his voice vibrating in Elara's very bones and making her wolf wake up. Her heart skipped when Varick finally lost his mind and lunged forward with his claws out. The king was fast, but Fenris was much faster. He caught the king's throat in one massive hand and slammed him back against the bone throne. A beat later, the iron claws drew their weapons, heavy wooden clubs tipped with burning silver. With his scent in the air, cedar winter and a hint of wood smoke, Fenris looked back at Elara over his shoulder. "Run," he whispered, and it was a command that she felt in the very core of her soul. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Elara realized she couldn't just leave him here to die alone. The air thickened as more and more guards rushed into the hall from the side doors. Time stood still as Fenris threw the Alpha King across the room like he was a bag of old, dry grain. Her voice trembled as she called out his name for the very first time. "Fenris!" He didn't look back again, focused on the fight. He was a wall of muscle and dark fur. As the silence roared, he fought off 3 guards at once with his bare hands. He was a blur of beautiful, terrifying violence. He was a monster, but he was her monster. Her breath caught when they finally reached the great iron gates of the inner den. The massive doors were already closing, moving on heavy chains. The king's men were trying to trap them both inside the walls to be executed. The space between them burned as Fenris grabbed Elara by the waist and threw her through the narrowing gap. He stayed behind to hold the gates open. He grabbed the edges of the heavy iron and held them with his bare hands. Her chest ached, seeing the veins bulging in his neck and the blood dripping from his knuckles. "Go to my barracks!" he roared over the sound of the guards' boots. "The cliffs! Go now, and don't look back." In the quiet that followed her escape, she heard the loud, heavy sound of the gates slamming shut with Fenris still on the inside. Her thoughts spun as she ran as fast as her legs would carry her toward the dark, jagged cliffs. As the echo faded, she realized the warhound had just started a war for an Omega he had never even spoken to. Her name hung in the air, whispered by the cold wind in the pine trees. In the stillness that followed, she finally reached the barracks, a cold stone fortress on the edge of the world. Her bones remembered him, and she could still feel the heat of his hand where he had gripped her waist. As the mark tingled on her neck, a mark she didn't even know she had until this moment, she looked back at the den. Her soul answered the call of the wild. The warhound had blocked the gates, and now the hunt was finally on. The wind carried his name through the trees, and she knew her life would never be the same. Elara stood by the heavy wooden door of the barracks and listened to the wind howl against the cliffs like a wounded animal. The stone walls were damp and smelled like old rain, moss, and the cold iron of the mountains. As she felt small in this room because everything here was built for a warrior twice her size and 10 times her strength. There was a single bed covered in thick, dark wolf pelts and a fireplace that had been cold for a long, long time. What followed was a silence so heavy and thick it felt like it was pressing the very air right out of her lungs. She paced the floor back and forth, her footsteps echoing like drum beats in the dark. Eventually she stopped by the narrow, unglazed window and looked down at the den far below. Torches were moving like angry fireflies near the gates, lighting up the valley in flashes of orange. The king's hunt had officially begun, and she was the only prize they wanted. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop picturing Fenris standing alone against the king's iron claws at the gate. He was a monster to the rest of the pack, a man who killed without a word, but he had thrown her to safety like she was something precious. Soon after, she heard a sound that made her heart stop and her blood turn to ice. It was a heavy, dragging noise coming from the stone path outside the door. It sounded like a massive beast trying to find a place to hide before it died. Her body moved on instinct as she grabbed a heavy iron poker from the cold hearth. Her knuckles turning white, she didn't know if she were going to fight a guard or a ghost. Before she could move, the door groaned on its heavy hinges and swung open with a bang. At that moment, the smell hit her first. It was cedar, deep winter, and the hot, metallic tang of fresh, steaming blood. Fenris stumbled into the room, his massive frame filling the entire doorway and blocking out the pale moonlight. He wasn't wearing his dark cloak anymore, and his bare chest was covered in long, jagged gashes from silver-tipped claws. As if fate demanded it, he collapsed to his knees right in front of her, his head hanging low. His breath was coming in wet, ragged hitches that made her own chest tighten with pain. A beat later, Elara dropped the iron poker and knelt beside him on the cold floor, her hands hovering over his stained, hot skin. She was terrified because she had never seen a warrior this strong look so close to breaking. Truth be told, she should have been running for the secret tunnels while the king's guards were busy at the gates. Instead, she found herself pulling his heavy, muscular arm over her shoulder to help him crawl toward the bed. He was too big for the room. He was too loud for the silence. He was too much for her heart to handle. Because of that, she felt the hush waking up again, desperate to soothe the agony radiating off him in waves. He suddenly grabbed her wrist with a hand that was still half shifted into black claws. The moment their eyes locked, she didn't see the king's executioner. She saw a man who had traded his honor for her life without even knowing the sound of her voice. Meanwhile, the storm outside finally broke, and heavy rain began to lash against the stone barracks with a roar. Elara worked in the dim light of a single candle, washing the thick blood from Fenris's chest with a basin of cold water. He didn't make a single sound, even when she had to use her fingers to pull a silver-tipped splinter from his shoulder. At the same time, she felt his golden eyes tracking every move she made, focused on her like a predator watching its mate. Have you ever felt someone's gaze so strongly that it felt like they were touching your very skin? That was how Fenris watched her. As the silence stretched, she realized he wasn't just watching her. He was protecting her even while he was bleeding onto the pelts. Deep down, she knew the truth. This man was the only thing standing between her and a life of misery in the northern lands. She remembered when her mother used to tell her stories about the Shield of the Moon, a warrior who would come when the light faded. Elara used to think it was just a fairy tale for children who were afraid of the dark. In fact, she felt the mark on her neck tingle again, a warm heat spreading under her skin like a blooming flower. She looked down at his hand, which was resting near her hip on the bed. As the bond pulsed, she felt a surge of raw energy pass between them that made her breath catch. It wasn't the fake, oily pull she felt with Varick. This was a primal connection that made her inner wolf howl in her mind. "Why did you do it?" she whispered into the dark room. Her voice was small and shaky, echoing off the stone walls. Before either could speak, Fenris reached out and touched the bruise on her cheek where the king had hit her. His fingers were rough and scarred, but his touch was as gentle as a falling leaf. Because he was the king's executioner, everyone in the den thought he had a heart made of cold stone. Rather, Elara felt the heat of his soul through his fingertips, burning into her skin. "You are mine," he rasped, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. What's worse, saying those 3 words seemed to cost him more than the entire fight at the gate. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Elara realized she didn't want to run away into the forest anymore. She wanted to stay right here in the shadow of this broken, beautiful giant. On the other hand, she knew the king wouldn't stop until these barracks were burned to the ground. Moments later, she saw a black raven feather she had found earlier fall from the folds of his tunic. It was a sign of the man in the cloak, the one who was looking for her blood. She didn't know what scared her more, the king's guards or the secret Fenris was hiding about his own past. That night, she realized that the warhound wasn't just a traitor to his king. He was a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. In the stillness that followed, the sound of a heavy horn blasted from the bottom of the cliffs. It was the king's call to surrender, a sound that meant death for anyone who didn't obey. Without warning, The heavy wooden door of the barracks shuddered under a blow that made the hinges scream. "Fenris! Open the door and give us the Omega girl," a voice shouted from the other side. It was Joran, the boy Elara had saved from the feral madness in the kitchen. As if the world narrowed, Elara looked at Fenris, her heart pounding against her ribs. He was still too weak to stand, his deep wounds still seeping red onto the dark fur of the bed. Because she had used the hush to save Joran, the boy was now leading the hunt to find her. It was a bitter, a painful irony that made her chest ache with every breath. Her world tilted when Fenris tried to push himself up, his muscles bunching and screaming with the agony of the move. Before the words left her lips, she put her hands on his broad shoulders to hold him down. "No," she said, her voice stronger and harder than it had ever been in her life. "I will go to the door." As her wolf stirred, she felt a power rising that didn't belong to a weak Omega. She felt the strength of the mountains and the fury of the storm in her veins. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She realized she wasn't the one who needed a savior today. She was the one who had to save the man who had bled for her. With every step he took to try and follow her, he left a trail of red on the floor. Elara reached the door, her hand resting on the iron bolt. She felt the hush rising like a cold silver tide inside her soul. She didn't want to calm the guards this time. She wanted to drown them in the silence of the grave. Without thinking, she pulled the heavy iron bolt back and swung the door open to face the rain. 6 guards stood there in the mud, their silver-tipped spears gleaming in the flash of lightning. The air thickened as Joran stepped forward, his young face pale and full of a guilt he couldn't hide. "Elara, just come with us," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "The king says he will forgive the hound if you just come back now." As the silence roared, Elara looked him straight in his yellow-tinted eyes. Truth be told, she saw the fear in their hearts because they knew the warhound was inside this room, which meant they were only brave because they thought he was too wounded to fight back. Beneath the moonlight that cut through the clouds, Elara straightened her back and let the silver light of her power shine in her eyes. "He is not your hound anymore," she said, her voice echoing off the jagged rocks like a thunderclap. "He is my mate." As if summoned, Fenris appeared behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder for support. He looked like a god of war rising from a fresh grave. Between them, something cracked. The last bit of fear Elara had for the Alpha King was gone. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she realized the choice was made and there was no going back. She was crossing the threshold from a servant to a rebel queen. Because they chose to stand together, the pack was now divided into 2 worlds. In the span of a breath, the guards lowered their spears, terrified by the raw power radiating from the girl they called weak. As the sky darkened, Elara realized they weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for a world where no one was a sacrifice. And she let it happen, reaching back to lace her fingers with Fenris's as the first of the king's elite warriors began to climb the cliffs below. The battle for the stone barracks had begun, and the silence was finally over. The border of the Deadlands didn't look like a line in the dirt. It looked like the place where the sun went to die. Elara stumbled over a rotted black root, and the grey dust of the wasteland kicked up into her lungs like 1,000 tiny needles. Behind her, the great den was nothing but a memory of fire and stone. She could still hear the a frantic howling of the king's hunters, but here the air was heavy, flat, and tasted of old ash. From there, the trees changed from green pine to a skeletal, bone-white wood that looked like frozen ghosts reaching for a sky with no stars. Elara gripped Fenris's arm, her fingers sinking into his thick muscle to keep them both from falling into the grey dirt. Next, she felt his massive weight lean more heavily against her side, and she realized he was fading fast. He was still bleeding, dark, thick drops of red that the thirsty ash of the ground swallowed up before they could even pool. Soon after, they crossed the invisible boundary where the pack's ancient magic stopped and the rot of the dead lands began. The transition was so sharp it made Elara's ears pop like a dry twig snapping. What followed was a silence so profound and deep, it felt like she had suddenly gone deaf. There were no crickets in these woods. There were no birds in the sky. Still, she pushed her tired legs forward because staying meant death and moving meant a different kind of danger. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like the walls were holding their breath just to watch you? That was exactly what the dead lands felt like to Elara. Yet, she didn't let go of Fenris for a single second. Even so, his breathing was getting much worse. A wet, rattling sound that made her own chest ache with every step they took. Despite that pain, he didn't complain or ask her to stop. He just kept his golden eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for a cave or a ledge where they could finally hide from the wind. On the other hand, Elara knew he was losing too much blood to keep up this pace for much longer. More importantly, she felt his wolf pacing inside his mind, restless and angry at its own broken body. In fact, the bond between them was humming so loudly now that she could feel the throb of his wounds as if they were her own. Not only that, she realized that the hush was reacting to this dead place in a strange, new way. What's worse, the power was expanding behind her ribs. Instead of just a silk net to catch one mind, it felt like a cold ocean rising in her throat, ready to drown the world. To make things worse, she saw a dark shadow move behind a white skeletal tree. It wasn't a guard. It was something smaller, faster, and much hungrier than any man. Moments later, 3 more shadows appeared in the fog. The ferals had finally found them. These were wolves who had been lost to the madness so long they were no longer shifters. They were just teeth, hunger, and matted fur. By the time Fenris noticed them, he was already baring his teeth in a weak, desperate snarl. Eventually they were cornered against a tall cliff of black glass that reflected the dim moonlight like a dark mirror. The ferals moved in a jagged, twitching circle, their ribs showing through their matted grey fur. Their eyes weren't yellow or brown like a normal wolf. They were a milky, sightless white that looked like boiled eggs. That night, the only light came from the faint glow of the moon hitting the ash on the ground. Elara felt Fenris try to step in front of her to protect her, but his knees buckled and he fell to one side. Come morning, she knew they would be nothing but white bones if she didn't act right now. But then, the largest feral lunged forward, its jaws snapping inches from her throat. Instead of screaming or running, Elara let the cold ocean inside her soul burst open. Rather than focusing on just one wolf, she threw the hush out in a massive shimmering ring that covered the entire clearing. Meanwhile, Fenris watched with wide, wandering eyes as the entire world seemed to freeze in place. At the same time, the ferals didn't just stop their attack. They collapsed to the ground. They didn't die, but the screaming madness that drove them was sudden. Gone. They looked around at each other like confused puppies, their hackles dropping and their tails wagging in the dust. Because of that, Elara realized the true depth of her hidden power. She wasn't just a healer of broken minds, she was a master of the wild itself. As a result, the ferals turned and trotted away into the thick fog, leaving the air tasting like ozone and fresh rain. So Elara slumped against the black glass cliff, her head falling between her knees as the world spun. That's why Fenris reached out and pulled her into his lap, despite the blood still seeping from his own chest, which meant he finally trusted her power as much as she trusted his legendary strength. Truth be told, she felt more powerful in this dead place than she ever had in the Great Den. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't remember why she had ever been afraid of her own soul. Maybe it was fate that brought them here, away from the king's cruel rules and iron gates. She didn't know what scared her more, the fact that she could stop a heart with a thought, or the fact that she wanted to use that power on Varick. Deep down, she knew the truth. The hush was a weapon, and she was finally learning how to aim it at the things that hurt her. Before she could move, Fenris pulled her closer to his chest, his scent of winter and cedar wrapping around her like a warm, heavy blanket. Without warning, he leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her skin. In that moment, the space between them burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the wasteland or the wind. As if pulled by a string, Elara's hands found the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his thick, dark hair. Her body moved on instinct, seeking the friction and the flame of his skin against hers. Without thinking, she realized she didn't care about the blood or the dirt or the danger anymore. She only cared about the way his heart beat against her chest, thump, 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 telling her he was still alive. As the silence stretched, she felt the mark on her neck flare with a bright, stinging light that made her gasp. With every heartbeat, the bond pulsed like a living thing between their souls. In the span of a breath, she saw his memories flash before her eyes, the king's betrayal, the cold towers, and the long years of silence. The moment their eyes locked, she saw the man behind the hound. He wasn't a killer because he liked it. He was a man who had been used by a monster until he almost broke. Without another word, he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle or soft kiss, it was desperate, hungry, and fierce. A collision of two lonely souls who had been starving for a lifetime. Before either could speak, the taste of him, like salt and fresh snow, filled her senses and made her world stop turning. As if fate demanded it, she pulled him deeper into the shadows of a small cave she found in the cliffside. Between one breath and the next, the heavy clothes they wore felt like armor they needed to shed to be real. In the echo of his voice, she heard him whisper her name again, but this time it wasn't a growl, it was a prayer. Before the words left her lips, she was showing him her own hidden scars, the ones Varick had left on her spirit. As the wind shifted outside, the small cave became their entire world. Beneath the moonlight that crept over the stone floor, their bodies entwined in a dance of fire, fur, and fated love. Under the weight of his stare, Elara felt herself opening up in a way she never had before in her life. While the forest held its breath, even the dead forest, They found the kind of peace that only comes after a long war. As the truth unraveled, she realized that her power didn't just hush the madness, it amplified the love they felt. Between them something cracked, and it was the very last of her loneliness. As her wolf stirred, it didn't growl or snap. It purred, a deep rhythmic sound that matched the steady thrumming in Fenris's powerful chest. With a single glance at his face in the dark, she saw his wounds were finally starting to close up. The hush was healing him from the inside out, knitting his skin back together. As if summoned, a low, deep vibration started in the ground beneath them. It wasn't an earthquake or a rock slide. It was the rhythmic sound of 100 wolves running in perfect military time. The tension broke when Elara realized the king hadn't just sent scouts to find them. He had brought the entire pack to the border. When her name left his lips, Fenris was already reaching for his strength, his golden eyes glowing like hot embers. As the sky darkened even further, the smell of the king's iron claws reached the cave entrance, the smell of smoke and sour sweat. While her pulse raced, Elara stood up and walked to the mouth of the cave to face the night. She didn't feel like a victim or a scapegoat anymore. She felt like a storm waiting to happen. With every step he took to stand beside her, Fenris looked more like the king he was always meant to be. As the bond pulsed, she felt the power of the Deadlands feeding into her soul. The ash wasn't just rot, it was the fuel for her fire. She felt it etched in fire, that this was the moment everything in the world changed. Her world tilted as she saw the first of the king's line appear on the ridge above the cave. Something inside her shifted, and the hush began to roar like a hurricane in her mind. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She wasn't going to hide her light anymore. As if the world narrowed to just the two of them and the army of the king, she prepared to show them what a worthless Omega could really do. Her heart skipped when she saw Varick at the head of the line, his black wolf form looking like a dark stain on the grey world. A beat later, he let out a howl that was meant to command her soul and make her kneel. With his scent in the air, she just smiled at him from the shadows. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she realized she was no longer his subject. The air thickened as she raised her hands, the silver light in her eyes blinding the front row of warriors. Time stood still as she prepared to hush the entire world. As the silence roared, she took a deep breath and let the power fly. The king had followed them into the Deadlands, but he didn't realize he was no longer the predator. The king's voice didn't just cut through the air, it ripped through her soul like a jagged blade. Elara stood her ground at the mouth of the cave while the wind whipped her hair across her face like tiny black lashes. High on the ridge, Varick let out a roar that shook the very glass of the cliffs and made the dust dance. It was a sound of pure, raw command that usually made every wolf in the pack drop to their bellies in fear. After that, a heavy silence fell over the Deadlands, but Elara did not kneel or bow her head. She felt the hush inside her pulsing like a second heart, growing stronger and colder than the king's burning heat. Next, she saw the front line of the elite Iron Claws hesitate because they had never seen an Omega stand tall against an Alpha's roar. They looked at each other with wide, confused eyes, wondering if the world had gone mad. From there, Elara pushed her power outward, creating a shimmering wall of invisible peace between her and the charging army. It wasn't a wall of stone, but a wall of pure will that made the warriors stumble. Soon after, the snarling wolves at the base of the hill began to whine and tuck their tails between their legs. They couldn't understand why their hot bloodlust was suddenly draining away into the grey ash of the ground. What followed was a psychological tug-of-war that made the very air vibrate with the scent of ozone and burnt sugar. Elara felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her temples, a warning that she was pushing her gift to its breaking point. Still, she didn't back down for a single inch because she knew that Fenris was standing right behind her. Yet, Varick wasn't finished with his games of power. He shifted back into his human form, standing naked and arrogant in the cold, biting wind of the wasteland. "You think you are special, Elara?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the bone-white trees like a ghost's laugh. Even so, he looked unsettled by the steady silver glow that was now pouring from her eyes. Despite that flicker of fear, he began to walk slowly down the slope toward them, his bare feet crunching on the black glass. On the other hand, Fenris moved forward, a low, tectonic growl vibrating in his chest that promised a slow and painful death to anyone who touched her. More importantly, the king held up a single hand, stopping his warriors from lunging forward into the hush. In fact, he looked like he was enjoying the terror he was about to unleash with his words. Not only that, but the king began to laugh, a dry and hollow sound that chilled Elara more than the winter air ever could. "You hide your power because you think it's a curse, don't you?" Varick said, stopping just 10 feet away from her. What's worse, he looked at her with a twisted kind of pity that made her skin crawl. To make things worse, he reached into a small leather pouch at his side and pulled out a lock of white hair tied with a red string. Moments later, Elara's breath caught in her throat because she recognized that hair from her earliest childhood memories. It belonged to her mother, the woman who had disappeared into the silent towers when Elara was only a child. By the time she realized what the lock of hair meant, Varick was already speaking the terrible truth into the cold air. "Your mother didn't die because she was weak, Elara. She died because she was the one who put me on this throne." Eventually the words sank in like lead weights in her stomach, making it hard to breathe. That night, long ago, her mother had used the hush to force the old king to abdicate his crown. But then, Varick realized that a woman with that much power was the only real threat to his cruel rule. Instead of loving her for the gift she gave him, he had drained her of her power and then silenced her forever in the dark. Rather than breaking under the weight of the lie, Elara felt a cold, hard rage begin to settle into her very bones. Meanwhile, the warriors in the background began to whisper among themselves in the shadows. They had been told for years that Varick was chosen by the moon goddess, not by a stolen spell from an Omega. At the same time, Fenris stepped up beside Elara, his golden eyes burning with a fury that matched her own. Because of that revelation, the king's authority began to crack like old ice on a warm lake. As a result, Varick's face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly hatred. So he realized he had said too much. But he didn't care as long as he could kill the only person who knew the truth. That's why he ordered the Iron Claws to attack with everything they had, regardless of the hush or the peace. Which meant the real battle for the Dead Lands had finally begun in earnest. Truth be told, Elara didn't know if she could hold back 50 trained warriors at once with her mind. No matter how hard she tried, she felt her mental wall beginning to crumble under the sheer weight of their collective aggression. Maybe it was fate that intervened, or maybe it was just the dead lands answering her call for help. She didn't know what scared her more, the wolves charging at her or the raw, untamed power screaming to be let out of her soul. Deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't just an Omega. She was the rightful heir to a power that could reshape the entire world. Before she could move, Fenris shifted into his massive black wolf form and met the first wave of attackers with a spray of hot crimson. Without warning, Elara let out a scream that wasn't a sound, but a massive psychic blast that hit the mountain. In that moment, the ground beneath their feet shattered into 1,000 pieces of glass. As if pulled by a string, the grey ash of the wasteland rose into the air, forming a blinding whirlwind that separated them from the king's men. Her body moved on instinct as she grabbed Fenris's thick fur and pulled him back toward the deeper, darker glass caves. Without thinking, she used the chaos and the dust to hide their tracks from the hunters. As the silence stretched behind the wall of dust, she felt her mind spinning with the weight of the king's dark secret. With every heartbeat, she realized that Varick hadn't just stolen her mother's life. He had stolen her entire history. In the span of a breath, she transformed from a runaway into a true revolutionary. The moment their eyes locked through the settling dust, she saw that Fenris knew it too. There was no going back to the way things were. Without another word, they retreated into the dark, yawning throat of the caves, where the wind couldn't reach them. Before either could speak, the sound of the warriors' paws faded away behind them in the storm. As if fate demanded it, they found a small hidden chamber deep underground that smelled of ancient stone and dry earth. Between one breath and the next, Fenris shifted back into his human form, his skin slick with the hot blood of his enemies. In the echo of his voice, Elara heard the determination she needed to keep her heart beating. "We take it back," he said, his voice stronger and clearer than it had ever been before. Before the words left her lips, Elara realized she had to master the hush if she wanted to survive the long night. As the wind shifted through the narrow cave tunnels, she sat on the cold floor and closed her eyes to the dark. Beneath the moonlight that barely reached them through a tiny crack in the ceiling, she began to reach for the memories Varick had tried to bury. Under the weight of his stare, she felt herself becoming something new and much more dangerous. While the forest held its breath outside, she reached out to the pack's bond, not the king's fake bond, but the true connection of all wolves. Have you ever felt 1,000 heartbeats at once? As the truth unraveled, she realized she could speak to every single wolf in the den, from right here in the dark. Between them, something cracked, and it was the king's invisible hold on his frightened people. As her wolf stirred, she felt the power of 1,000 ancestors standing right behind her. With a single glance at Fenris, she saw him smile, a predatory and beautiful sight that made her heart race. As if summoned, the shadows in the cave began to dance with a brilliant silver light. The tension broke when Elara let out a low, vibrating hum that echoed through the entire mountain range like a bell. When her name left his lips, it felt like a crown being placed on her head. As the sky darkened even more, She prepared her final message for the pack. While her pulse raced, she visualized the king's face and the big lie he had lived for 20 years. With every step he took toward her, she felt the fire blooming beneath her skin like a sun. As the bond pulsed, she sent out a single devastating thought to every wolf under Varick's command. The king is a thief. She felt it, etched in fire, that the revolution had already won in the hearts of the people. Her world tilted as she felt the pack's collective shock and the fear of the Alpha King. Something inside her shifted, and she was finally whole, a girl made of silence and storm. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and the worthless Omega was gone forever. As if the world narrowed to just this cave and the battle to come, she took Fenris's hand in hers. Her heart skipped as they prepared to leave their hiding place and face the dawn. A beat later, they walked out into the cold night, ready to face the king one last time. As the silence roared, she knew that the warhound and his queen were finally coming for the throne. The secret was finally out, and the king's crown was already turning to ash in the wind. I never wanted to lead an army of ghosts, but the dead were the only ones who didn't lie. Elara stood on a flat, jagged rock and looked out at the crowd of wolves gathered in the grey valley of the Dead Lands. They weren't the polished, proud warriors of the Great Den with their clean fur and silver armour. These were the broken ones, the ones the pack had forgotten and thrown away. They were the ferals she had hushed, and the outcasts who had lived in the dirt and ash for years. After that, she felt a strange humming warmth in her chest that she had never known before. She wasn't just a servant or a worthless Omega anymore. She was a beacon of light in a dark place. In fact, every one of these wolves was looking up at her with eyes that were finally clear and full of a desperate hope. What followed was a low rumbling sound as they all bowed their heads to the ground at the exact same time. Still, she felt the crushing weight of all those lives resting on her slender shoulders. "I can't promise you that every one of you will survive the night," she said, her voice carrying through the cold, flat air like a bell. "The king has walls and he has silver, but he does not have the truth." Yet she didn't see a single wolf turn away or whimper in fear. Fenris stood at her side, his massive black fur ruffling in the biting wind like a flag of war. He looked like a god of the night, strong and unyielding. Even so, he stayed half a step behind her to show every wolf in the valley that she was the one in charge of this revolution. Despite that power, he leaned in and whispered in her ear, so only she could hear him. "They will die enough for you, Elara." His voice was like deep, rolling thunder that made her heart dance. Because she had used her gift to give them their minds back, these wolves owed her everything they were. On the other hand, Elara didn't want their lives or their blood. She only wanted their freedom from the king's lies. More importantly, she realized that Varick would never expect an army to come crawling out of the Dead Lands. The king thought the wasteland was a grave, and not a garden for a new kind of power. In the stillness that followed her speech, she felt the hush expanding out from her ribs again. It felt like a soft silver blanket covering the entire valley and quieting the wind. Not only that, the magic made the wolves feel brave and strong, as if their old wounds had never happened. What's worse, she could feel the king's scouts closing in on the border with their silver spears. To make things worse, She knew they only had a few precious hours of darkness left before the sun came up and exposed them all. Next, they began the long, quiet march back toward the mountains of the den. The moon was high and bright in the sky, acting like a silver lantern to guide their feet through the ash. Elara walked next to Fenris, their shoulders brushing with every step they took. Moments later, they stopped by a small, icy stream to drink and rest their tired legs. The water was so cold it hurt her teeth, but it felt good against her dry, dusty throat. By the time she finished drinking, Fenris was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her lungs. That night, the entire world felt like it only belonged to the two of them, even with an army resting nearby. But then, he reached out a scarred hand and gently tucked a stray hair behind her ear. "Elara," he murmured, his voice sounding like velvet rubbing against stone. His golden eyes were soft and glowing, reflecting the moonlight in a way that made her feel beautiful. Instead of looking away or feeling shy, she leaned into his touch and closed her eyes. Rather than talking about the war or the blood that was coming, she just wanted to talk about them. Meanwhile, the army of outcasts rested in the long shadows of the trees, their eyes watching for any sign of the king's men. At the same time, she felt the mark on her neck burning with a sweet, pulsing heat. It wasn't a mark of ownership like Varick wanted. It was a mark of a soul that had finally been found. Because he was her true mate, his touch felt like fire and silk moving over her skin. Because of that deep connection, she could feel his heart beating through his chest, steady, strong and full of love for her. As a result, she felt a surge of desire that made her dizzy and weak in the knees. So she grabbed the front of his rough tunic and pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of winter and hope. It was deep, it was desperate, and it was everything she had ever wanted. And that's why she didn't care about the danger or the king's hunters anymore. Which meant that even if they died when the sun rose, she would die knowing she was truly loved. From there, they reached the base of the high cliffs, where the secret tunnels began. These were known as the throat of the den, old passages that even the king had forgotten about years ago. Soon after, the army of broken wolves began to disappear into the dark, yawning hole in the side of the mountain. She didn't know what scared her more, the tight, damp tunnels or the bloody battle that was waiting for them at the other end. Deep down, she knew the truth of the situation. There was no turning back now, and the only way out was through the heart of the enemy. Before she could move, Fenris took her hand in his grip solid and warm like a promise. At that moment, they entered the thick darkness of the mountain together. The tunnels smelled of wet earth, ancient stone, and the bones of wolves who had died long ago. As if pulled by a string, Elara followed the map she had seen in the king's private library when she was a servant. Her body moved on instinct, dodging the low-hanging rocks and the puddles of cold water. Without thinking, she used the hush to keep the entire army of 100 wolves perfectly quiet. It was like they were moving through a dream where no footsteps made a sound. As the silence stretched, she could almost hear the heartbeat of the mountain itself. With every heartbeat, they got closer and closer to the center of the den. In the span of a breath, the air around them changed and became much warmer. It started to smell like the roasted meat and the expensive wine of the great hall above them. The moment their eyes locked in the shadows of the tunnel, She knew they were standing directly beneath Varick's bone throne. Without another word, Fenris began to move the heavy stone slab that sat above their heads. He was so strong that the rock moved without making a single screech. Before either could speak, a tiny sliver of orange torchlight cut through the dark like a blade. As if fate demanded it, they were finally inside the walls. Between one breath and the next, they climbed out into the king's private cellar, surrounded by barrels of ale and salted meat. In the echo of his voice, which was a low whisper, Fenris gave the final command to the waiting outcasts. Wait for the signal. And then I kill. Before the words left her lips, Elara felt the king's presence in the room directly above them. He was angry, and his voice was muffled but full of hate. He was shouting at his guards about the worthless Omega who had escaped his grasp. As the wind shifted through the cracks in the floorboards, she heard him mention a name that made her blood freeze. He was talking to the man in the black cloak, the Raven. Beneath the moonlight that struggled to reach through the cellar vents, she saw the fear in the eyes of her small army. They were in the belly of the beast now, and the beast was hungry. Under the weight of his stare, Fenris looked at Elara one last time before the fight. He was her shield, he was her sword, and he was the heartbeat of her new world. While the forest held its breath outside the mountain, they prepared to strike at the heart of the corruption. As the truth unravelled, she heard Varick tell the Raven that he was planning to use a silver poison on the pack's water supply to keep the survivors loyal and broken. Because the king was a liar and a murderer, he had to be stopped tonight, or there would be no pack left to save. Between them, something cracked, the very last bit of hesitation she had. As her wolf stirred, she felt her silver power peaking like a mountain of ice. With a single glance, she told Fenris she was ready to end this nightmare. As if summoned, the light in her eyes turned a brilliant, blinding silver that lit up the dark cellar. The tension broke when they burst through the heavy cellar doors and into the main hallway of the palace. When her name left his lips, it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a battle cry that shook the stone walls. As the sky darkened with the coming of the dawn, the revolution hit the heart of the den with the force of a landslide. While her pulse raced, she saw the look on the guards' faces as they turned to fight. They didn't see a weak Omega anymore. They saw a queen of silence coming for her crown. With every step he took, Fenris cleared a path through the elite iron claws with his bare hands. As the bond pulsed, Elara sent out a massive wave of silence that knocked the silver spears right out of the guards' hands. She felt it, etched in fire, that this was the point of no return for the world. Her world tilted as the massive doors to the Great Hall flew open with a bang. Something inside her shifted as she saw Varick sitting on his throne, his face turning pale and white with shock. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and the war was finally home. As if the world narrowed to just her and the Alpha King, she raised her chin in defiance. Her heart skipped as she saw the Raven sitting right next to the king, his black hood pulled low. A beat later, the Raven stood up and slowly lowered his hood to reveal his face. As the silence roared, Elara realized the final, most painful twist of her life was just beginning. The man in the black cloak didn't just know her mother from the towers. He was her father, and he was smiling at her like she was a prize he had finally caught. The face of the man who shared my blood was colder than any winter I had ever known. Elara stood frozen in the centre of the great hall as the man in the black cloak pushed back his hood. He had her eyes, pale, silver, and full of secrets, but there was no love or warmth in them for her. At that moment, the very air in the stone room turned so cold she could see her own breath puffing out in white clouds. He didn't look like a hero or a father who had been searching for his lost child for years. He looked like a hunter who had finally cornered his best prize after a very long chase. What followed was a sound that broke Elara's heart into tiny pieces. A dry, rattling laugh from King Varick that echoed off the high rafters. "You see, Elara?" the king mocked, leaning back on his bone throne with a cruel smile. "The raven didn't come to save you from me. He came to collect his property." Truth be told, Elara wanted to scream her lungs out, but the words felt like jagged glass stuck in her throat. She looked at Raven, the man who was her father, and realized he was the one who had let her mother die. Without thinking, she understood that her mother hadn't been a victim of Varick alone. She had been betrayed by the one person she should have trusted. Before she could move, the raven raised a single hand toward her. He didn't shift into a wolf or growl. Instead, he released a wave of dark energy that felt like the exact opposite of Elara's hush. It didn't bring any peace or calm. It brought a crushing, heavy static that made her brain feel like it was starting to bleed. After that, the outcasts she had led through the tunnels began to howl in terrible agony. They clutched their heads and fell to the hard stone floor, their eyes rolling back in their heads. Elara tried to reach out with her own gift to save them, but the raven's dark power was like a wall of black iron in her mind. Next, Fenris lunged forward with a roar that shook the torches in their brackets and made the fire flare up. He was a blur of black fur and pure, unadulterated rage, heading straight for the raven's throat. From there, everything in the plan went horribly wrong. Soon after, Varick's elite iron claws dropped from the rafters like spiders, armed with heavy nets made of woven silver. What's worse, Fenris was already tired and weak from the fight at the gates and the trek through the ash. To make things worse, the silver nets sizzled against his skin, smelling like burning hair and old hot copper. Elara watched in horror as the strongest man she had ever known was pulled to the ground by 10 warriors. Moments later, he was pinned down, his golden eyes locked on hers with a look of absolute heart-wrenching agony. Still, he didn't stop fighting until the raven stepped forward and pressed a silver-tipped staff against the back of his neck. Yet Fenris didn't growl or snap his jaws. He just whispered one single word through the pain that broke Elara's soul. "Run!" By the time Elara found her voice to scream, the king's guards had already surrounded her on all sides. "Why are you doing this?" she choked out, looking at the man who was her father. Meanwhile, the raven walked toward her with a slow, predatory grace that made her want to crawl away. "Your mother was a fool, Elara," he said, his voice sounding as smooth as a snake moving over a rock. "She thought the hush was a gift for peace, but I knew it was a tool for power." At the same time, Varick stepped down from his throne and grabbed Elara by the chin with his sharp claws. He drew a tiny bit of blood, but she was so numb she didn't even flinch. Because of that terrible betrayal, Elara felt like her soul was being shredded into 1,000 ribbons. As a result, she looked at the man who shared her blood and felt nothing but a deep, black void in her chest. So, she realized that her entire life had been a lie built by these two monsters. That's why she didn't even fight when the guards snapped heavy silver shackles around her wrists. The cold metal burned like fire against her skin, and her hush flickered out and died like a candle in the wind. Which meant she was finally as weak and helpless as they always wanted her to be. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't reach for the bond with Fenris in her mind. It was like a heavy iron door had been slammed and locked in her brain. Maybe it was fate that brought her back to this den, but it felt more like a trap she had walked into with her eyes wide open. She didn't know what scared her more, the thought of being used by her father or the sight of Fenris being dragged away toward the deep dungeons. Deep down, she knew the truth of it all. She had led the man she loved straight to his death, and she would never forgive herself for it. That night, the cells in the bottom of the den were colder than the Deadlands ever were. Elara sat on a pile of damp, stinking straw, her wrists raw and bleeding from the silver chains. The air smelled of rot, old blood, and the stale sweat of 1,000 prisoners who had died here. Eventually, the silence of the dungeon began to roar in her ears, until it was the only thing she could hear. Have you ever felt so alone that you could actually hear the sound of your own heart breaking? That was Elara's dark night of the soul, as she sat in the dark. She looked at the stone walls and saw the faces of every person she had failed today. In the quiet that followed, she thought about the power of the hush and what it really meant. She had spent her whole life trying to hide it because she thought it was a curse that made her a target. Instead, she realized the real curse was her own fear of her own strength. Rather than using her power to lead her people to freedom, she had used it to hide in the shadows like a coward. As the silence roared, she felt the weight of her internal flaw pressing down on her chest. She had been waiting for a fate mate to come and save her, when she should have been the one saving herself this whole time. In the stillness that followed, she heard a very faint sound from the stone cell right next to hers. Her name hung in the air, whispered so softly it might have just been the wind in the cracks. Elara. It was Fenris, and he was still alive, but he sounded like his life was fading away. As the echo faded, she pressed her ear against the cold, damp stone wall to be closer to him. Her bones remembered him from the barracks and the cave, and she could almost feel the heat of his body through the rock. As the mark tingled on her neck, even through the burn of the silver, she realized the bond wasn't actually gone. It was just buried under her fear. Her soul answered his call with a sob she couldn't hold back, and for the first time, she felt her true power waking up in the dark. As if fate demanded it, she felt a tiny spark of silver light deep in her gut that the shackles couldn't reach. The silver was supposed to kill her power, but it couldn't kill the part of her that belonged to the moon. Between one breath and the next, she stopped being a victim and a scapegoat. In the echo of his voice, she found the strength to stand up on her shaky legs. Before the words left her lips, she whispered a promise to the darkness and the stone. I am coming for you, Fenris, and I am bringing the silence of the moon with me. As the wind shifted through the high, barred window of the cell, she felt her inner wolf stir for the first time in days. Beneath the moonlight that barely touched the floor, she began to pull on the silver chains with everything she had. They burned her skin and made her scream, but she didn't care about the pain anymore. And under the weight of his stare, even though he couldn't see her, she felt his belief in her strength. While the forest held its breath outside the mountain, Elara began to hum a low, vibrating song. It wasn't a song of peace. It was a song of war. As the truth unraveled, she realized that the hush didn't come from the sky. It came from her own will to survive. Between them, something cracked, and this time, it was the silver of the shackles. A tiny hairline fracture appeared on the metal of her left wrist. As her wolf stirred, her eyes began to glow with a fierce, blinding silver light that filled the cell. With a single glance at the iron door, she knew she was going to break it down or die trying. As if summoned, the shadows in the corner of the cell began to swirl and move. The tension broke when she felt the raven's dark power trying to probe her mind one last time. When her name left his lips in her head, she didn't flinch or pull away. As the sky darkened outside, she prepared her counterattack. While her pulse raced, she visualized the silver breaking like glass. With every heartbeat, the vibration of her humming grew louder and louder until the walls began to shake. As the bond pulsed, she felt Fenris's strength feeding into her from across the stone wall. She felt it, etched in fire, that the worthless Omega was dead and gone. Her world tilted as the silver shackle finally snapped with a loud metallic ping that echoed through the dungeon. Something inside her shifted, and the hush flooded back into her veins like liquid ice. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and she was no longer a prisoner of the king or her father. As if the world narrowed to just her, and the mission to save her mate, she reached for the iron bars of the door. Her heart skipped as she felt the metal begin to grow cold and brittle under her fingertips. A beat later, the heavy bars shattered like they were made of thin glass. As the silence roared, she stepped out into the hallway to find him. The king thought he had broken her, and her father thought he could use her, but they both forgot one thing. A wolf is most dangerous when it has nothing left to lose but its life. The silence was over, and the war was finally starting. The door to his cell didn't just break, it screamed as the iron turned into a cloud of red dust under my fingers. Elara stepped into the darkness of the deepest dungeon, and the smell of old blood and burnt silver hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Her heart was a drum beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and her eyes were glowing so bright they lit up the damp stone walls like twin moons. Fenris was chained to a heavy stone pillar in the center of the room. He looked like a fallen god of war. His fur was matted with grime, and his skin was covered in the ugly black marks of silver poisoning. After that, she saw the way his heavy head hung low, and for a terrifying second, she thought his soul had already left his body. Next, a low, broken sound came from his throat, a growl that was half whisper and half prayer for death. She knew she had to save him because he was the only truth she had left in a world made of lies. From there, Shashi rushed to his side and threw her arms around his neck, ignoring the cold bite of the silver chains. She didn't care about the guards who might be running down the stairs. She didn't care about the king's orders or the raven's dark magic. Soon after, she felt the hush flowing out of her like a river of liquid starlight, warm and powerful. She wasn't trying to quiet his mind this time. She was trying to feed him her very own life force. What followed was a moment of pure, raw connection that made the very air in the stone cell vibrate and hum. Have you ever seen a mountain crumble into the sea? That was the sound the heavy silver chains made when Elara's power finally snapped them into 1,000 tiny pieces. Still, Fenris was too weak to stand on his own shaky legs. He slumped against her, his massive weight nearly pinning her to the cold floor. Elara held him tight, her fingers digging into his muscles because he was the only thing that felt real in this nightmare. Yet, she knew they couldn't stay here in the dark for even a minute longer. Because the raven was already moving toward the ancient vault on the peak, every second they wasted was a second the world got closer to ending. Even so, she took a brief moment to press her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of cedar and winter that was finally starting to return to his skin. Despite that deep weakness in his limbs, Fenris's golden eyes suddenly snapped open. They weren't dull or cloudy anymore. They were burning like twin suns in the dark. On the other hand, he looked at her with a mix of fear and wonder that made her heart ache. "You came are back," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves on stone. More importantly, he reached out a trembling hand to touch the glowing mark on her neck. It was pulsing with a soft silver light that felt like a heartbeat. In fact, it wasn't just a mate mark anymore. It was a crown of light. Not only that, she realized that their bond was the only thing keeping them both alive. She was the savior, she was the mate, and she was the storm. By the time they reached the old guardhouse, the hallways were already filled with the sound of running boots and shouting voices. Elara and Fenris moved like shadows through the lower levels of the den, dodging the orange torchlight. Eventually they found the remaining outcasts, huddled in the shadows near the secret tunnels. They looked like ghosts. Their fur was patchy, and their eyes were full of a hollow kind of terror that made Elara want to cry. They followed her because she was the only one who had ever given them their minds back. In fact, they had been forgotten, they had been broken, and they had been the ghosts of the pack. Not only that, but Joran stepped forward from the back of the group with a determined look on his young face. He was holding a silver-tipped spear, but he wasn't pointing it at Elara or the hound. He was holding it out to her, like an offering of peace. What's worse, the air felt thin and cold, as if the mountain itself was scared of what was coming. To make things worse, the ground began to shake with a low vibration that made the stones rattle. Elara realized the raven was starting to pull on the magic of the vault. Moments later, she took the spear from Joran, and she saw hope returning to the faces of the outcasts. That night, she felt like she was a part of a story her mother used to tell her when the moon was full. It was the story of a girl who had to bite the moon just to find her way home. Come morning, the world would be different. But for now, they had to survive the freezing darkness. But then, a low, deep horn blasted from the mountaintop. Instead of being afraid, the outcasts let out a collective growl that sounded like a landslide. Rather than hiding, they were finally ready to hunt the monsters who had hurt them. Meanwhile, Fenris stood at the front of the line, his black fur standing on end as he looked toward the peak. At the same time, Elara felt an open loop in her mind finally closing. The silver key her father wanted wasn't an object he could find in the dirt. It was the very blood moving through her veins. Because of that realization, she knew she had to get to the vault before him. As a result, she led the way into the secret tunnels one last time, her eyes lighting the path. So they ran through the dark, a pack of shadows and starlight. That's why the guards at the tunnel exit didn't even stand a chance when the outcasts hit them, which meant the final race for the soul of the world had truly begun. As if fate demanded it, they stepped out into a massive blizzard just as they reached the high mountain pass. The snow was a white wall that bit at their eyes and tried to freeze their very breath in their lungs. She didn't know what scared her more, the biting cold or the dark energy pulsing from the vault above. Deep down, she knew the truth of the Raven's plan. He didn't want to lead. He wanted to unmake everything. Before she could move, a massive shadow fell over the narrow path. It was the king's elite unit, the Iron Claws, waiting for them with silver blades. At that moment, Fenris didn't wait for a single command. He shifted in a blur of fur and muscle, becoming the black beast of the old war stories. As if pulled by a string, the outcasts followed him into the fray, throwing themselves into the fight with a desperation that was terrifying to see. Her body moved on instinct as she used the hush to blind the Iron Claws, turning their own hot aggression back into their heads. Without thinking, she realized that the mountain itself was watching them with cold, stone eyes. As the silence stretched across the bloody snow, she saw her father standing at the entrance to the silver vault. With every heartbeat, the mountain groaned as if it were in pain. The vault doors were made of solid silver and engraved with the history of the very first shifters. In the span of a breath, the raven turned toward her, his black cloak flapping in the wind like a crow's wings. The moment their eyes locked, she felt his dark, oily power trying to grab her soul and pull her to her knees. Without another word, he pointed a long white finger at her. "Come, daughter," he called out over the screaming wind. "Open the gate and witness the end of the world." Before either could speak, Fenris let out a roar that actually shattered the falling snow in the air. He stood as a wall of black fur between Elara and her father. As if fate demanded it, the two men who had defined her life were finally face to face. Between one breath and the next, the raven just laughed, or a sound that was colder than the ice. In the echo of his voice, Elara heard the sound of the vault's massive lock beginning to turn. Before the words left her lips, she realized that she was already too late to stop the opening. As the wind shifted, the heavy silver doors began to swing open with a scream of metal. Beneath the moonlight, which was now a sickly blood-red colour, the vault revealed its dark secret. It wasn't full of gold or treasure. It was full of the original madness that had almost destroyed the wolves once before. Under the weight of his stare, Elara saw that her father had lied to everyone. The raven wanted the vault, he wanted the magic, and he wanted the end. While the forest held its breath far below, the first of the ancient shadows began to crawl out of the silver gate. As the truth unravelled, Elara realised that the only way to close the door was to use her own life as the lock. Between them, something cracked, and it was the very ground they stood on as the mountain trembled. As her wolf stirred, Elara felt the hush turning into a roar of silver fire. With a single glance at Fenris, she told him what she had to do, even if it meant she would never see the sun again. As if summoned, the light in her eyes became a beam of pure, blinding energy. The tension broke when she stepped toward the vault, her hands glowing like white-hot fire. When her name left his lips, it was the most beautiful and painful sound she had ever heard. As the sky darkened with the ancient shadows, she prepared to give everything she had left to save him. While her pulse raced, she felt the bond with Fenris pulling her back, trying to keep her safe from the dark. With every step he took to follow her into the light, he was risking his own life. As the bond pulsed, she made her final choice. She felt it, etched in fire, that this was the ending she was born for. Her world tilted as she stepped into the freezing silver light of the vault. Something inside her shifted as she touched the cold silver doors with her bare hands. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and the girl who was a scapegoat became the guardian of the world. As if the world narrowed to just her and the darkness, she began to push with all her might. Her heart skipped as she felt the raven's magic trying to snap her bones. A beat later, Fenris was there, his massive paws pressing against the silver right beside her hands. As the silence roared, they pushed together. The ancient vault was finally closing, but the price of the key was more than Elara ever expected to pay. The cold of the vault didn't just freeze my skin, it tried to turn my very blood into glass. Elara stood inside the mouth of the silver vault, and the ancient madness clawed at her mind like 1,000 invisible needles made of ice. The air was thick with the scent of old dust, ozone, and the rotting, dark magic of her father's desperate spells. She could feel the raven's dark energy swirling around her, a black storm that wanted to swallow her soul and leave nothing behind. In that moment, she realized that she was the only thing standing between the world and a darkness that would never end. Because the raven was a thief who had stolen her mother's peace and her own childhood, Elara refused to let him take another single soul. She planted her feet on the cold stone and pushed her hands against the heavy silver doors with every bit of strength she had left. Without warning, a bolt of black lightning shot from the raven's fingers, hitting the shield of her hush with a sound like a mountain splitting apart. Elara's knees buckled under the weight, and the sharp taste of copper filled her mouth as the psychic pressure nearly crushed her skull. Before she could move, King Varick lunged into the chamber, his black wolf forming a blur of teeth, fur, and pure hatred. He wasn't looking at the raven anymore, he was looking at Fenris with a hunger for death. As if pulled by a string, Fenris met the king in mid-air, a collision of muscle and fur that sent a shockwave through the entire stone cavern. Her body moved on instinct as she reinforced her mental wall, and drawing on the raw, ancient energy of the Deadlands to keep the doors from flying open. What followed was a battle that the history books would never be able to fully describe with words alone. As the silence stretched, Elara watched Fenris and Varick tear into each other, their claws leaving deep, white gouges in the stone floor. With every heartbeat, she felt the bond with Fenris pulsing in her blood, giving her the strength to hold the silver doors against the screaming shadows. In the span of a breath, the raven stepped closer to her, his face twisted into a mask of pure ugly greed. "Give me the key, Elara," he screamed over the roaring wind of the vault. "Give me the power your mother was too weak to use before she died." The moment their eyes locked, Elara finally saw the hollow void in his soul and realized he was never a man. Wah, Without another word, she didn't just push the doors, she pulled the silence from the very core of the earth and the moon above. Before either could speak, she let out a scream that wasn't a sound, but a massive wave of pure silver starlight. Between one breath and the next, the light hit the raven, reflecting his own dark magic back into his chest. In the echo of his voice, he realized too late that she wasn't a pawn or a tool. Before the words left her lips, the raven was consumed by the very shadows he had tried to control, pulled into the vault by the ghosts of his own victims. As the wind shifted, the silver doors slammed shut with a finality that shook the entire range. Beneath the moonlight that bled through the mountain's cracks, the Alpha King slumped to the floor as Fenris delivered the final blow. Under the weight of his stare, Varick finally saw the truth. He had been defeated by a worthless Omega and a silent hound. While the forest held its breath outside, the ancient madness was sealed away in the dark forever. As the truth unravelled, the king's crown of lies turned to ash in the freezing wind. Between them something cracked, and it was the last of the king's dark reign over the people. He was the shield, he was the fire, and he was the heartbeat that kept her alive through the dark. As her wolf stirred in the deep quiet that followed the battle, Elara collapsed to her knees, her body trembling from the massive release of silver power. The silver vault was silent now, a cold tomb for her father and the king who had tried to break her. With a single glance across the chamber, she saw Fenris shifting back into his human form among the rubble. He was covered in blood and dust, his broad chest rising and falling in heavy, painful gasps that made her heart ache. As if summoned, she crawled toward him across the stone, her fingers dragging through the grey ash. The tension broke when he finally reached out and caught her, pulling her into his lap with a strength that shouldn't have been possible after such a fight. When her name left his lips, it was the most beautiful and perfect sound she had ever heard in her life. Elara, we are free. As the sky darkened with the fading of the magic storm, she buried her face in the crook of his warm neck. While her pulse raced, she felt the bond between them settling into a warm, steady glow like a hearth fire in winter. With every step he took to stand up and carry her out of the cave, she realized that they had survived the impossible. She felt it, etched in fire, that they were no longer outcasts or ghosts. They were the masters of their own destiny, and the world was finally quiet for them. Her world tilted as they emerged from the dark mountain to find the army of outcasts and the remaining pack members waiting in the snow. Something inside her shifted when she saw Joran and the other warriors drop to their knees as she passed. They weren't bowing because of a roar or a command from a throne. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and they were bowing because they chose her as their leader. As if the world narrowed to just this moment of peace, Elara looked at the tired faces of her people. Her heart skipped as she saw the hope in their eyes, a light that hadn't been seen in the den for 20 years. A beat later, the outcasts began to howl together, a long and beautiful sound that carried across the Deadlands and reached the sky. With his scent in the air, Fenris stood tall and proud, his hand locked tightly in Elara's. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she realized that the found family of the broken was now the true pack. The air thickened with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat as the survivors began to set up a safe camp in the valley. Time stood still as Elara realized she had a home and a purpose for the first time since she was a child. Her voice trembled as she looked up at the man who had given everything for her. "What do we do now, Fenris?" As the silence roared with the weight of her question, he leaned down and kissed her with a passion that made her dizzy. Her breath caught at the tenderness of his touch, a stark contrast to the violence of the silver vault. The space between them burned with a promise of a future that didn't involve sacrifice or secrets. Her chest ached with a joy so intense it felt like her heart would burst out of her ribs. In the quiet that followed, he looked out at the new pack with golden eyes that were full of peace. "We build a better world." Her thoughts spun with the possibilities of a life where the hush was a gift of healing, not a weapon of war. As the echo faded, she knew she would never have to hide her soul again. Her name hung in the air as the new sun began to rise over the mountains, painting the world in beautiful shades of pink and gold. In the stillness that followed, Elara and Fenris sat on the high steps of the great den, which was finally being cleaned of the king's rot. Her bones remembered him, the man who had blocked the gates to save her when she was just a scapegoat. As the mark tingled on her neck, she felt the ultimate connection of fated mates who had chosen each other through blood and fire. Her soul answered his every thought, a perfect harmony of silence and strength that made her feel whole. The king was a liar, the raven was a thief, and the old world was finally a lie they had outlived. The wind carried his name through the new green leaves of the forest, and for once the forest wasn't holding its breath in fear. Shadows danced between them, but they were no longer scary things that hid monsters. They were just part of the morning light. Her instincts surged as she felt her inner wolf wanting to run, to celebrate the freedom they had earned with their lives. As though fate whispered in her ear, she realized that she was not just a queen, but a savior to every wolf who had ever been forgotten. A growl rose in her throat, a playful and happy sound that made Fenris smile for the first time in years. As if the forest watched, they stood up and began their first run together as the leaders of a new, kinder era. Her wolf pressed forward, the wind whipping through her silver-tipped fur as she raced across the green meadows. And she let it happen, letting the hush expand to cover the entire territory in a wave of unnatural, beautiful peace. Because her mother had been betrayed by the ones she loved, Elara vowed to never let a single wolf feel alone or discarded again. Because Fenris loved her soul more than her power, she would always be his sanctuary and his home. Because they were fated by choice rather than just blood, their bond was stronger than any ancient magic in the world. Because the hush was meant for peace, the den would finally be a place of rest for the weary. Because they were the survivors, they were the ones who would write the new laws of the moon. She was not a servant, she was not a tool, and she was certainly not a sacrifice for a man's greed. He fought with the strength of a wolf, the heart of a man, and the soul of a true mate. The crown was heavy, and the responsibility was great, but the love she felt was infinite. Truth be told, the Alpha King had tried to send her away to her death, but his warhound had blocked the gates and found his queen instead. Have you ever wondered if the stars were just the souls of the brave watching over us from the dark? Elara looked up at the sky and knew her mother was finally resting in peace. In the quiet that followed, Elara realized that being chosen by the one you love is the greatest power in the universe. As the bond pulsed one last time before they shifted into the wild, she felt the fire blooming beneath her skin. Her world tilted as they disappeared into the trees together, two souls who were finally home and safe. Something inside her shifted, and the silence was no longer a cage or a curse. It was a song of love. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and they lived happily ever after in the light of the moon. The warhound and the silent executioner had finally found their peace, and the gates would never be closed to love again.